The views and opinions of the host and guest of the following show may not be those of this radio network, its sponsors, or affiliates. User discretion is advised.
Welcome to
Weird News Weekly with
Diane Brown and
Norm Solbush.
hello and welcome to a very special Weird News Weekly as it comes up to the anniversary of the most tragic event in American history. I'm Diane Brown in Nottingham and my co-host is over the pond in Ohio. Hi Norm.
Hello, Diane. How you doing today?
Yeah, not too bad. We've got a guest.
Okay, that's what I heard.
This is totally different. We usually do news items, but this, of course, is remembering John F. Kennedy, Oswald, and J.D. Tippitt. And so we have got a guest with us.
My name is Peter Dale Scott, and I'm the author of a number of books on the Kennedy assassination. The two most relevant here are a book that came out 22 years ago, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, and then just 2 months ago, or last month, a smaller book, an e-book so far, called Dallas 63, The First Deep State Revolt Against the White House. And in both of those, I talk about Oswald, much less about Tippitt, but a lot about Oswald.
Well, the Tippitt case was a main focus. They had to try and prove that he killed Tippitt to link him to killing the president, didn't they?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, when Oswald was first brought into the police station, he was only charged with the killing of Tippitt, and then the press said, are you charged with the president's murder? And he said, no, I have not been charged with that. And this disproves the standard explanation of his behavior is that he was a loner who felt insignificant and was looking for publicity. But when he had a chance to boast that he was the killer of the president, he said accurately, no, I have not been charged with that. He hadn't been at that point. And then later on, the next thing they were planning to do until Washington intervened was to accuse him of having killed the president as part of an international conspiracy. And that, of course, would have had all kinds of foreign policy implications. But as I say, Washington intervened and stopped the state from doing that. And even though the crime of murder legally was a state crime, not a federal crime, so the federal government had really no right to do this, but they did it, and then retroactively, sometime later, passed a law making it a federal crime to kill the president. But there was no such law at the time that Oswald was indicted finally. Well, of course, he was killed, so not all these legal questions were moot. But you've brought up a very important point, that what he was first charged with was the killing of Tippitt.
Yes, and of course there was people that gave evidence, witnesses giving a description of the killer, and from half of them it wasn't Oswald's description.
The description that was put out on the police network, what they were looking for was a man who was 5'10" and 165 pounds. Well, the Oswald was weighed at the autopsy. He was 5'9" and I think 141 pounds. Maybe it was 139 pounds. And the description that they broadcast was a description of Oswald that was in his FBI file and in his CIA file, but was not accurate, and it was only a guesstimate that had been given to the FBI by Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald, in 1960, when Oswald, in fact, was in the Soviet Union. And he had been weighed by the Marines, who was in the Marines, but he was never 5'10", and he was never 165 pounds, that was just something that his mother made up.
I think that was a very strange family.
Yes. First of all, they were barely a family. The father was dead before Oswald was born, and he had two half-brothers. And I believe that when he first came back from Russia in 1962, he stayed with his stepbrother, and his wife in Fort Worth for a bit, moved in with his mother for a bit, lived in Fort Worth for a bit, and then between the fall of 62 and the day that he was murdered, he saw his so-called family exactly once, which was Thanksgiving 1962. And there are many weird things about that encounter. One of them is that they called him Harvey. And I think actually that his real name was probably Harvey Lee Oswald, because we find many, many files all over the place talking about Harvey Lee Oswald, and then a lot of them were changed to say Lee Harvey Oswald. I think the really important files, if we ever see them, will turn out to have been files about Harvey Lee Oswald, most of them probably destroyed by now.
So there wasn't a Harvey Oswald and a Lee Harvey Oswald then?
Well, there's a man called John Armstrong who's made a very, very lengthy argument that there were, in fact, two Oswalds, one Lee Harvey and one Harvey Lee. I think he started with a very interesting fact that there seemed to be conflicting high school records. And then my own personal feeling is that he enlarged it a bit too much. He has two Oswalds in Dallas on November 22nd, the day of the assassination. I doubt that. We certainly have conflicting reports. Some of those conflicting reports, I think, are just noise. You always get conflicting reports about any big event. Some of them, I think, were perhaps deliberately placed, and that those are worth studying. But undeniably, we had people testifying to the Warren Commission, and they would say Harvey Lee Oswald, and then the counsel interviewing would correct him and say Lee Harvey Oswald, and the man would say, yes, I meant Lee Harvey Oswald. One of my other books I didn't mention is Oswald, Mexico, and the CIA. I have a whole appendix on all these records. So there are dozens of them. There are far, far more even. I think there are actually hundreds. When they started these files, they never intended that they would be released. And we had a Records Review Act that that was in the 90s, that got a lot of records released. And it was worth doing. It hasn't solved the case, but it certainly made more and more clear that something very big was going on, both about the assassination and also before that, perhaps quite independently, about Lee Harvey Oswald. There are hundreds and hundreds of pages about him, and he's supposed to have been an insignificant loner. No, the intelligence agencies were very interested in him.
Oh, yeah, I agree there. He wasn't a stupid man. I mean, I've listened to the radio interviews that he gave, and people can hear those on YouTube. They are there.
Yeah. He did a debate.
Yes.
His most interesting period for us researchers is when he's in New Orleans in the summer and fall of 1963, and he having been doing very little out of the ordinary for over a year, he suddenly becomes hyperactive. And he's obviously playing roles, because on August the 5th, he goes into an anti-Castro Cuban organization and acts like an anti-Castro ex-Marine who wants to show them how to blow up things in Cuba. And 4 days later, he's acting as a pro-Castro activist, and he's handing out literature for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. These are two opposite roles. And then a few days after that, he is handing out more Fair Play for Cuba Committee literature in front of TV cameras. Now, I've handed out literature in my day, but I've never been able to get a TV station and come and film me doing it. But Oswald was able to do that. And then he had a radio interview for 5 minutes, and that's one of the things you can still hear. And a few days after that, he was in a debate with Ed Butler from the Information Council of the Americas. Ed Butler is a self-professed propaganda agent, and this whole enterprise, I think, the whole debate was a propaganda operation to make Oswald look bad. And Oswald, I think, felt he was doing it on Butler's behalf, perhaps as part of an operation against Castro. He had no idea, I suspect, that it would be used after his death to make him look like a Marxist, pro-communist assassin of the president. I don't think that was in his mind, but I think he did feel he was playing a role, and he thought he was very smart, but other people smarter than he was were using him in ways that he could not understand.
I'm not sure about that last thing he did with his wife, leaving the wedding ring, though. Did he know he wasn't coming back?
Did he know he was going to be killed? No, I don't think he did.
I don't think he knew he was going to be killed, but I think he knew something was going down.
Oh, yes, of course he knew something was going down, but I think he thought it was against Castro.
He knew about the assassination attempts on Kennedy. They was going to do him in Florida, which was cancelled, and then someone called...
It all happened later, though, after the broadcast.
Yes, that's right. Someone called Lee contacted the FBI and told them that there was a group of assassins waiting for the president in Chicago.
Yes, that was the beginning of November. All of this happened after he had allegedly gone to Mexico and come back, which was right after these broadcasts we're talking about.
I wonder if he actually set up the double.
I'm not convinced there was a double. I mean, we don't know, shall we say.
Because there's no photographs of him, but they photographed someone else that they thought was him in Mexico.
Oh, you're talking about Mexico. Yes, absolutely. I don't even think he was a double. I don't think he, in the sense that somebody, what you're talking about in Mexico is somebody went into the Mexican consulate and tried to get a visa and went back and forth to the Russian consulate. I've written a great deal about this in this Oswald, Mexico and Cuba book. Then that was on a Friday, and then the next Tuesday, somebody called Lee phoned the Soviet embassy and said he had been in there talking to an official, and the Soviet official said Kostikov, and the man who identified himself as Lee Oswald. Not, by the way, I mean, we're certain, any sensible researcher knows that was not Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'll explain why in a minute. But first, the important thing is that this telephone conversation was recorded. The cable about it was sent by the CIA to Washington and linking Lee Oswald to Kostikov. Well, the files in Washington not only said that Kostikov was a KGB agent, the FBI files said he was a KGB agent who specialized in assassinations. So this is a really explosive cable. And it's all part of a game being manipulated in Washington. You seem to think that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man, was part of this game. I don't myself, but the people in Washington, the CIA, get this cable, and they notify the FBI that Lee Oswald has phoned the Soviet embassy, and they suppress the name of Kostikov, which is exactly what they should have alerted them to in the first place. What I conclude is that the FBI already knew about it, and that this cable was just put in for the files so that they have a documentary record. And we know it's not really our Oswald, because what happened right after the assassination was that they took the recording of the voice and a photograph of a man who had come into the Cuban consulate on the Friday, presumably, I would think, the same, possibly, and quite probably, the man who made the the phone call, and they flew them. It was so urgent and sensitive that these were flown up to Dallas, and they played the recording to some of the police officers who had interviewed Oswald. No, it must have been the FBI officers who had interviewed Oswald before the assassination, and the people who interviewed him in the day or two right after the assassination before he was killed. And these people said, no, that's not the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is one of the things we only learned about later. And of course, the photograph is not of him either. It's of a man in his 30s. Been a great hunt for the mystery man in the photo. They never found him. We only know all of this happened after the assassination because they showed the photograph to Oswald's mother. This was after Oswald had been killed, and she mistakenly thought it was a photograph of Jack Ruby, and so she told everybody, the press and later the Warren Commission, why were they showing me a photograph of Jack Ruby? And they had to put the photograph into the record of the Warren Commission. And eventually, when we discovered a message that the FBI sent to the Secret Service saying it's not Oswald's voice, that's now part of our record too. And the Assassination House Committee on Assassinations, that was another cover-up activity. And they tried to deny that this had happened, but it was a lawyer who wrote it very carefully, and he said it's been alleged that a recording of Oswald's voice was taken to Dallas, and then they say this didn't happen, that no recording of Oswald's voice was taken to Dallas. Of course, no recording of Oswald's voice was taken to Dallas. It wasn't Oswald, it was somebody else. And by this kind of lawyer's game, they're almost in effect acknowledging that it did take place while pretending to claim that it didn't.
Obviously it wasn't. I have heard a little bit of it, and it didn't sound anything like Oswald.
Have you heard the recording? I have not.
There is a little bit of it online, yes. A lot of research ends up online because they're sharing everything they can.
Yes, we're really lucky to have the internet because there are hundreds of us now all researching this, and slowly a picture is being put together. I don't know that we'll ever know who the shooters in Dallas were, but that's not the important thing. What we need to know is who was behind the assassination, and we see by the behavior of the government agencies that some people in those agencies, and I think we can name some names here, were in on the conspiracy. And just take, for example, this business about the cable. The people who in the CIA suppressed the name of Kostikov knew that something big was going on. And the reaction in the FBI shows that they too knew that something big was going on, because ever since Oswald had come back from the Soviet Union, he was in the Soviet Union from 59 to 62 as a so-called defector, and we can talk about that. He was acting then too, I believe. He's an actor. And the FBI, when he came back, did a reasonable thing. They put him on a watch list, that anything he did should be followed very closely. Well, they get this cable from the CIA saying that he's just been to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. And what do they do the very same day? They take him off the watch list, as if he's somebody you don't have to worry about anymore. And to me, that's a very significant act, because it's something you had to do if he was going to be the designated culprit in the assassination. If he was going to be the alleged assassin, then it was very important that he not be under surveillance, that the FBI not know where he is, that they not notify the Secret Service to watch out for him, because if they'd been watching out for him and knew where he was, it would have been a completely different story. Somebody else would have had to have been the designated culprit.
Because you had a witness that could alibi him. Somebody that
Yeah.
probably wasn't in on the big event.
So we have people who are playing games with Oswald. That's another significant thing, that the Oswald files had been dormant, really, for a year after he came back from the Soviet Union. Nothing special happening. And then suddenly, in the weeks before the assassination, starting with his behavior in New Orleans, which also was noticed in Washington, there's a flurry of activity. And, you know, I compare this to what happened in 9/11 with the alleged hijackers. We know that two of the alleged hijackers it's a very similar story, that the CIA knew about them, suppressed information about them until just before 9/11, and then there's a flurry of activity about them, and in a way which got some honest FBI agents very upset that the games were being played with these people too, and they should have been under surveillance. They weren't under surveillance, and then it's a rerun of the Oswald story. Oswald should have been under surveillance. He wasn't under surveillance.
The 9/11, it does stem back to the Kennedy era, where they actually made up a scenario: let's blow up some places and blame it on Castro, and then we can go into him.
Yes, right. They did have that plan, yes. Actually, at the time of the Bay of Pigs, they had wanted to fake an attack on Guantanamo, the base on Cuba, U.S. base, and then use that as a pretext to actually invade with U.S. troops Cuba. And the reason it didn't happen was that the team, under a man called Nino Diaz, they didn't fake the attack because it was rough seas and they couldn't get ashore. So there was no fake attack, and they lost their pretext for an invasion. Yes, you're quite right. There is that analogy between the two.
Yes, I did sort of link that to 9/11 when that happened, and it was like history coming back, and they've gone back to an old scenario and carried it out all these decades later.
There's another book of mine we haven't mentioned, The American Deep State, and I say at some length in that book what I also say in Dallas 63, that we've had a series of structural deep events. They're deep in the sense that they're very important. We don't understand what's going on. We're given an official story by, in both cases here, a commission is appointed to tell us what happened. The version told by the commission is full of holes and based on faked testimony. And 9/11 commission is based on testimony extracted by torture, which the tortured people later disowned. And I mean, it's shocking that the American people, most of them apparently, well, no, I mean, I have to be careful here. We are told these things. Actually, American people don't believe these commission verdicts. It's always been something like 70 or 80% of the American people suspect a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. But that's what we live with. We are not being given the truth in this country. We are a country that lives on fake ideologies that are based on lies and phony evidence. And this is a symptom that our democracy has gone very wrong. And you could say it started going wrong as soon as America became a world power, because you cannot reconcile global power, which has to be top down, with self-governance on a local level, which has to, if it's going to work, has to be bottom up. So in a sense, it goes back to World War II, you might say, but it's really dates in a big way from the Kennedy assassination. We've had a series of these deep events which some of them have been very bad for presidents. Watergate is another structural deep event. There's something called the October Surprise in 1980, which helped sink Jimmy Carter. And since then, we've had deep events like Iran-Contra and 9/11, but they've not been deep events against the president. They've been deep events against Congress in the case of Iran-Contra, and really against the American people in the case of the biggest of all, which is 9/11.
So I just want to interrupt here. I'm just sucking up all your information. This is kind of you're very knowledgeable. At what time did you, as far as this Kennedy assassination, I mean, you were younger. When did you decide that you knew something was wrong? You remember it live, right? I mean, you remember it when it happened.
I'm one of those who can remember very vividly where I was both times. You know, on a superficial level, I suspected something was wrong almost immediately, but at first it never occurred to me that I would get involved in this. What I did know something about and drew me into the assassination, I knew something about Indochina. This is also the beginning of the Vietnam War. The first thing I ever published about it was a question which I reissued later on as an assertion. Was it a coincidence that 3 weeks after the murder of the president of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, at a time when he was considering finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in Vietnam, is it a coincidence that 3 weeks later you have the murder of a president in Washington who was beginning to explore the same idea? And that was a question to me when this is the first book I ever wrote, actually, back in 1966, 3 years later. And then in 1972, I published a book called The War Conspiracy. And there, it was no longer a question. It turned out that I had been more on the nail than I could have known at the time. This is the first thing that really got me involved, that President Kennedy had authorized the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam in October of 1963, NASM, National Security Action Memorandum 263. And 1 month later, and listen to the date, November 26, 1963, that withdrawal order was quietly annulled by a new NASM, as we call them, that's NASM 273, which said that support would remain at the same level or higher. And November 26, of course, is 4 days after the assassination of Kennedy. It's the first National Security Action Memorandum from Johnson, and the decision we now know was actually formulated on November 24th, before Oswald had even been murdered in the Dallas Police Department. So that's it. It was my interest in Vietnam that got me interested in the Kennedy assassination, and I have been still pursuing that issue ever since.
Just to bring this up, I spent 5 hours watching the hearings on Hillary. What's your take just on the top of what's going on there, if anything?
Well, I guess most people are old enough to remember the Whitewater hearings into Hillary's husband, Bill Clinton, when he was president. This is a rerun of a really shabby Republican trick. They start with what is a legitimate inquiry. In the case of Bill Clinton, it was some real estate deal, which, by the way, they never found anything wrong with in the end. But they got opened, and Bill Clinton's mistake was to keep giving the committee whatever they wanted, and it ended up being investigating his sex life. And the American people wisely, I think, said, yes, we would prefer to have a president who was faithful to his wife and so on, but we were going to actually impeach a president because he had a sex affair. This is a Republican game gone crazy. And now we're having the same thing with Hillary. They started with an investigation of Benghazi, which is a legitimate investigation. But then, one of the people on that committee boasted on television not long ago, we are going to sink Hillary's presidential hopes with this investigation. It isn't about Benghazi anymore. They've been for months. The newspapers have been filled with speculations about her email. And, as a former diplomat myself, I think she made a mistake by using a private server for her email. She should have said that at the very beginning. She's made many mistakes since it came out, just like Bill made mistakes. But this whole thing is, it's become an avowedly political campaign to elect a Republican president. And it's just shocking that the Republican Party doesn't have better things to live for than these sort of ad hominem pursuits of individuals.
As far as politics, I mean, the American public, in my opinion, think that this is just normal politics that's going on today. In your opinion, do you call it unethical? I can't see where this is politics. This is not politics.
America has some terrible politics. It also has some good politics. There's so many things that are wrong in Washington that I think it's important to remind ourselves that sometimes they do things that are right. Now, of course, the trouble with America is we don't agree as to what's right. One thing I think we can all agree on is since 1945, there has not been a nuclear war, even though we've had more and more nuclear powers with their fingers sort of itchy on the trigger. And I think it's quite incredible that we haven't had a nuclear war. And there are a lot of presidents that I disliked at the time. I disliked Lyndon Johnson because of Vietnam. Now I look back upon him as quite a good president because he gave us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act, and he really, more than any other individual, is responsible for ending a terrible situation in the southern United States. And then we had Nixon, who I disliked even more than Johnson. But when I look back on it, he achieved détente with the Soviet Union. That was an end to a very dangerous phase in the Cold War. I hope we're not going to revive it now with disagreements over Syria and Ukraine. So, yes, politics can be good or bad depending on what you look at. But in the Congress in particular, it's like two groups of people not speaking to each other. It's like a marriage that's gone completely wrong. You're supposed to have a two-party system in which the two parties negotiate. You have one of the parties, people are getting elected with a promise not to negotiate. I blame the American people for that. They shouldn't elect those people.
Maybe it's our education system. I don't know.
Democracy. We're very democratic in this country, and democracy requires your right to bring up education. It only works if people are educated, and the world, I think, very slowly is learning how to do with these things. Now, let's take race relations, for example. There's got to be a lot of re-education here, and the news is full of the ways in which America has a really desperately bad racial situation where black teenagers are being killed by policemen. But at the same time, let's not forget, policemen are also being killed by blacks. So it looks like we have we do have a terrible situation. I suspect that it's America, when it comes to race, is a better educated country than any other country. Europe is just beginning to experience this with the refugees coming in, and they've been coming for some time, and we see that in civilized countries like France and Germany and even Norway and Denmark and Sweden, all very well educated, they're dealing with major intolerance of all these people coming in, so that racist parties are becoming more and more popular in France and in Denmark in particular, but other countries, Germany now too, yes. So we're bad, but we're not necessarily the worst. I think we're in some ways the better.
Because here in the UK, we've lost patriotism because that's racist.
Yes, yes. Well, you've got to decide in Britain whether you want to be part of Europe or not.
Personally, I don't.
I mean, there's different levels, isn't there? Right now, you don't use the euro, so that you're not fully a member. I think myself, and I won't, on Britain I won't pronounce, because there's a good argument either way, but for France and Germany to be in some kind of union, I think is vital to all of us, because it has put an end to these ridiculous but very devastating wars that tore Europe apart in the last century. And it's modeled, all of that is modeled on the American achievement, which was a bit similar in the 18th century, of bringing 13 different states together and making a union out of them. And that took a civil war in America. This is not an easy thing to do. And Europe is just beginning, but I think that's a process that's worth doing. Whether Britain should be part of it or not, I'll leave that up to you.
I think Europe trying to tell England or the UK what to do is actually against one of our laws, because Henry VIII put it in law that no other country can form our laws. We're a monarchy. We'll always be a monarchy.
I think the problem with the European Union is it's right now, the power is in Brussels with a bunch of bureaucrats who are not elected. So it's not a democracy. And that actually is a bit like America between 1776 and 1783. They were a confederation, and they had no real substantial substance to it, and then they adopted the Constitution, provided for elections and so on. Europe has to have direct elections of people in power. You have to have banks which are responsible to the government. Right now it's all top down, and that's not working. I totally agree it's not working. I mean, look at the Greece crisis, for example. So there's a lot to be done, but whatever mess it is, it's better than France and Germany arming to go back to war against each other.
Well, where the euro's concerned, we need the pound. The euro is bringing in countries that couldn't sustain their own currency, and they're not going to be able to sustain the euro. Poland's getting it next. They're all in fear of this euro because when they bring the euro in, prices double, and it's extortionate in Poland anyway. And then there's Greece, and they're going to be bailing these countries out. They're going to have to. Spain was another one. Its currency was worth nothing.
The special case of England is that you're still a global power when it comes to trade and commerce and banking. And so that's very different. I mean, you can never put that on a par with, say, I don't know, Romania or Portugal or these countries. So that's why, actually, you and I might disagree on this, but I believe in strong local democracies, and I also think we need more governance on the global level than we have now. I think that banking should be supervised on a global level because you can pass all the laws you like to try and control banking, but you get these offshore places like Cayman Islands or Macau, and they're all over the place, and they make a mockery of attempts to control what banks do. And what banks do when it's not controlled is give us crises like what happened back in 2008.
Yes, I know there's a lot of money in offshore, but we do get bound up, and there are limits to who we can trade with while we're in the European Union.
Right, but you will find if you leave, there are going to be big downsides to that too, because then the European market, which is very important to you, will no longer be open in the way it was before. So that's why I don't know what the answer is myself.
I think pull out and see what happens.
I'm a Canadian, and so we have the same dilemma in Canada. We can try and go on our own, or we can try and be more part in a better, stronger union with America. There's something called the NAFTA. I don't know if you know what that is, North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah.
And I opposed that when it came up because I saw it as a restriction of Canadian sovereignty, and I predicted, I think rightly, that we would lose a lot of our industrial capacity because we wouldn't be able to compete with the Americans. Now, in retrospect, I think maybe it was not such a bad idea because, first of all, the Canadian standard of living has done quite well. Our dollar's down a bit against the American, but maybe that's good too because that means that we're more competitive. And now we've got a new one that will be with the Pacific nations, all of the Eastern Asian countries except China, big exception, China. And again, Canada is going to lose some of its industrial capacity making auto parts and things because it'll be cheaper from South Korea. But I don't know. It's an honest dilemma. I think you pay a big price if you're not part of these things because you're then excluded and they're all trading without you. So there's maybe a good argument you shouldn't have this Pacific Treaty at all, but if there's going to be such a treaty, then I think Canada has to be part of it. So it's a dilemma, just like you face a dilemma.
It is, yes. We need to strengthen the Commonwealth.
Oh, that was the big hope. And America, I must say, they really stuck an oar into that to make sure that didn't happen. Yes, it was the idea in the 30s you would have Commonwealth preference and all of the American aid, which England needed, it really needed after World War II, was on condition that there not be these preferential trade agreements. So what America was doing, it set up its own free trade agreement, which America was part of. So that was the end of Commonwealth preference. And let's face it, Commonwealth preference could not have competed against American power. We have to accept that American power is something one way or another. We have to deal with it, no matter where we live in the world. And that's true for Putin and China as well. They also have to deal with it.
Do you, as a Canadian, feel terrible or good about these tar sands and that argument about that?
I feel terrible about the tar sands. And, the trouble is it's a lot of money that can speak. I feel very good about this election we just had in Canada because Harper was the great exponent of the tar sands. And they're a bit at risk now because with the price of petroleum going so low, it's no longer the economically viable project that it was. And Harper was going to keep it alive anyway. And I think that even the opposition parties in Canada are hesitant to come out firmly against it. But it ecologically is a disaster. An absolute disaster, and even from a point of view of energy, it uses so much energy to create energy, and it uses so much water to create energy, and water itself is becoming an increasingly scarce commodity and will continue to become increasingly scarce, so that I'm totally against the tar sands. Now, you're down in Texas. How do you feel? I'm against that pipeline. How about you?
I'm right here in Ohio. The pipeline, in my opinion, will most likely be passed if the Republicans get in there. And I do not like it. I do not want it. And I live by railroad tracks. So the backside of it is I have all these people. I have friends that work on the pipeline that are basically, I've lost friendships over this argument because I don't believe in the pipeline coming down from Canada with tar sand oil. It's very volatile. Nobody talks about it, but you see, just YouTube, go to YouTube and see some of them explosions. It's
And of
very
course,
scary.
alternatives are terrible too. You know, in Quebec, where I come from, we had this accident with oil being moved by train. It consumed an entire village, and
I know. I mean, I live a quarter mile away from the tracks, and we run oil through here, and who knows what might come down the road. Yeah, I'm concerned either way, but what do you do? We eat, sleep, and drink oil in this country, and I think it's so sad that everything revolves around this oil in the world anymore, that we're willing to give up some of our environment, we're willing to give up people's lives, even whole communities, over oil.
I think by 2020, I predict we will have an electoral campaign in America where the candidates will accept that climate change is a reality and that we have to take emergency measures to downplay the use of fossil fuels. It's not going to happen by 2016. We still have candidates who refuse to believe that it's a problem, even though 2015 was the hottest world ever recorded, and 2016 is going to be considerably warmer than that. So what has to change is that big corporations and big money and finance have to realize that their futures are threatened by this change, which of course they are, and that we will see the oil companies themselves saying we have to start planning for something different. And I see a corrective process at work in American politics. I think by 2020, I rarely predict, but I'll predict that we will have some sane candidates with sane proposals, and that the result will be that oil will not be the sacred, untouchable issue that it is now for most politicians.
I kind of look at a piston engine. You're an older gentleman, and that's all you've seen in your entire life was the piston motors. Don't you think that by now somebody would come up with some other form of ideas besides the piston, oil, gasoline, diesel motors that we're just constantly improving, but we're all concentrating on getting better mileage? Why not the whole concept? Throw it out the door. It's old. Let's start with some fresh idea.
Well, I'm sure that we're going to have major breakthroughs in technology here. In America, they've gone in the direction of the electric car, and I would never have imagined that they would have made the progress that they have. But I think there's still the wrong tree. And the Chinese are working on rapid mass transit, and they've had some big accidents, but they know more about moving people fast in trains than America does. We're behind them in this respect, and I think there's a future there. I never thought that we'd get to a stage where you could just turn on an apparatus on your desk and then speak long distance to two other people in different countries, but that's what you and I are doing this very second. I didn't know that would happen in my lifetime, and now it's normal. So technology can surprise us. I'm told that Bill Gates, the boss of Microsoft, in 1995, he told his employees, don't bother about the internet. It's a fad. Nothing's going to come there. And as a result, Microsoft really lost the leadership position that they had for a few years in the early 90s. These technology, it could easily kill us all. You know, the nuclear weapons we have now make the ones dropped on Hiroshima look puny. But technology can also save us, and let's just hope that the saving forces gain an edge on the destructive forces.
Well, thank you for your talk. I don't know how much time we have yet, Diane, but go ahead and follow up with how you want to follow up. But I appreciate his comments on what I've asked.
Yeah, well, we've got about 9 minutes, and we've gone totally off the Kennedy.
Well, we can bring it back just a little bit if you want to sum it up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I presume that you believe that Oswald wasn't on the 6th floor.
Well, whether he was on the 2nd floor or the 5th floor or the 6th floor, these are issues which I follow, but to me, I've always said from the very beginning, I'm not a Dealey Plaza man. I'm totally convinced that there were multiple shooters. I don't think Oswald was one of them. He may have shot, but what I should have said, I don't know that he shot at all, and if he did, I don't think it was his shot that killed the president. To me, the key to the assassination is what were people in Washington doing that day. Now, I'm not saying the government killed Oswald, the president. I don't believe that. I believe that people in the government working with other people whom they had close connections with, that's what I believe did happen. I said in 1993 in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, I said the president was killed by the deep political system. And now that I've defined something called the deep state, I would say he was killed by the deep state. And the deep state went on to force Nixon out of power because they didn't like détente with the Soviet Union. And they forced Carter out of power because he wasn't being ruthless enough with Russia and China. So the question of where Oswald was is not of real interest to me. I'm sure he was a designated culprit, and that's a very small part of a much bigger conspiracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you have got lots of books out, poetry books, and a biography on your father, haven't you?
I want to tell you, Diane, you said you were going to talk about my poetry. I feel all these other books of mine are not as important as my poetry. Not many people agree with me, but I was hoping you would at least ask a question or two about my poetry.
Well, being a fellow poet as well.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, you've got some poems out. You've got a biography on your father as well, haven't you?
Well, my father was a poet. My grandfather was a published poet. That's one reason I left Canada. It was sort of being a joke, being a third-generation Canadian poet. I didn't write a biography of my father. Somebody else did.
Oh, right. And all your books can be got on Amazon and thebookdepository.com as well. That's one of my favourite places to get the books.
Yes, and some actually, a lot of my stuff is online. I have a website, www.peterdalescott.net. Make sure you put net, not com. Somebody else registered peterdalescott.com. Somebody in, I forget, Russia or someplace. But a lot of my stuff, you can go there. Nearly all my recent political writings and poetry in periodicals is online, so that you can read a lot of it there, yeah.
Right, so you may have a double in Russia then.
I don't know what was happening there. Maybe they were just going to sell it back to me. I have no idea.
Ah, yes. There's got a few people claim that. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a very interesting hour with you.
Well, I hope I didn't offend you with what I said about Europe, because you know, one of the real signs of progress in my lifetime, and there are very few signs of progress, one of them is that Europe has grown up, and for all the problems they've taken on that they're not being able to solve, and you mentioned some of them, there hasn't been a war in Europe, and I think if we can avoid a war over the Ukraine, and there is no reason whatsoever to go to war over the Ukrainians, I know a lot about the Ukraine because I lived in Poland for 2 years, and it's a very serious problem, but it is not a kind of problem worth going to war over. I feel that passionately.
I feel that the Ukraine is like Ireland.
Exactly. That's what very well said. Except that Ireland is still officially divided, and maybe for the Ukraine that would be a solution. I don't know. They hate each other between the West and the East, and they have good reasons, both sides. They have good reasons to hate each other, going back in history to the great starvation of the Western Ukrainians in the 1930s to feed the steel workers in the Eastern Ukraine. And those things are not forgotten.
Well, Ireland's the same, that infighting, and the South still wants the North, And, the North don't want to be part of the South because they see how the prices are, and because they're getting free NHS in Northern Ireland, and they don't want to lose that.
You see, that's why I think that the solution is never going to be done on the Irish level. The solution is that both Great Britain and Ireland become increasingly, gradually, very slowly, not tomorrow, absorbed into a larger European Union, which is part of a global system. We take baby steps in this direction, but as we do this, the local problems become less important. The way in America the differences between the non-slavery North and the slavery South have now become not completely forgotten by any means, but greatly diminished by the developments in American constitutional practice.
And of course, a lot of Irish were sent to America as slaves, and they've not forgot that. And Oliver Cromwell, this is how far up some of the
Yes, we got both kinds in this country. We got the Catholics who came over as indentured, and we got the Protestants who had sort of had a history of oppressing the Catholics, and they tended to migrate into the southern states and treat their slaves the way they had treated their serfs on their lands in Ireland. Very different culture from the Puritans in the north who were coming to escape power. But here are all these different cultures in America that are slowly melding, where I could say there's been better progress in any other area, even though we're desperately far behind still, is in the question of handling the legacy of slavery. It's still bad, but it's so much better than it was, and it's a sign. The civil rights movement in the 60s, to me, is an example of how popular action, grassroots action, can achieve a social revolution that many people believed was impossible. And it happened, so it is possible.
Because America was built on slavery. The Mayflower, the first cargo, was slaves.
Oh, I didn't know that, but I did know that New England, Rhode Island, from one point of view, is a model because it's the first of the colonies to separate church and state. Many people flocked there, and many of the people who flocked there were slave traders. And Providence, Rhode Island became a center of the Caribbean slave trade. So, what's good from one point of view is bad from another.
Yeah, most certainly. Well, thank you very much. I hope you'll come back again sometime as well.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, but next time I want to see your faces and not just...
Okay, we'll do that, Peter. And I do appreciate you showing up and talking to us. I appreciate your knowledge. Here's a guy that wrote books, Diane, clear back when he couldn't just pick up a computer and Google something. He had to probably go to libraries, what people go to back in those days.
I remember those days.
You remember libraries.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you too. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I hope you'll join us again next week. So take care till then.